Hello, we're going to talk today about Mexico's history of democratization. Previous to this video, I asked you to watch a video on the Mexican Revolution. That is an important event in Mexico, all over Mexico. There are statues and things named after Zapata, Pancho Villa. Like the Mexican Revolution is definitely an important historic event. To backstep, it's important to understand that really, you've got Native Americans, particularly the Mayan Empire, then the Aztec Empire living in Mexico. Colonization by the Spanish it starts in 1519 with Hernan Cortez. Then we have in 1810, Mexicans fight for their independence. The Criollos, the Mexican-born descendants of the Spanish colonists, were inspired by the French and American revolutions. They fought for their independence. It lasts for 11 years and it costs over 500,000 lives. But then they have a government and it's independent. It's not controlled by Europe, but it's not very stable and it's not very democratic. For about 100 years. Then in 1846, Mexico actually loses about half of its territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War. And so it's important to recognize that Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah were all originally a part of Mexico, and that was taken by the U.S. when we won the Mexican-American War. And then that also created more instability because, for example, people then started rebelling, particularly indigenous communities, against Mexico's government. And then in 1910, they have the Mexican Revolution. After that, they have a revolutionary constitution, and then that does bring peace and prosperity to Mexico. The party that is established after the Mexican Revolution is the PRI, which is the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which we call the PRI. And the PRI stays in power from 1929 to 2000. The PRI gave the country political stability. And part of that came from the fact that presidents had a lot of power, and then presidents named their successors. So there wasn't they had peaceful transitions of power, and there wasn't a lot of arguing about who got to be the next president. For more than 80 years, no PRI candidate lost the presidential election. Presidents used their party, the PRI party, as well as the government to dispense patronage, which meant that they would give government contracts to their friends. They would give interviews to radios and newspapers that said positive things about them. But they used the party and the government to basically stay in charge. There was no check on the power of the presidency. Technically, it was a federal government, and so there were local and state governments. Technically, there was multiple branches, so that, like, for example, there was a Congress, but they didn't have a lot of power to actually check the presidency. The PRI controlled the majority of the seats in the legislature and the state and local levels, and so it really was a monopoly on power. That there were elections, but the candidates who were running and who won were, for the most part, the PRI. The PRI dominated the major trade unions and peasant organizations, which meant that the party founded the trade unions and the peasant organizations. So in the United States, we have interest groups which are lobbying the Democrats and the Republican parties, but they were not founded by the political parties themselves. They're trying to influence the political parties. Sometimes they fight with the political parties. But what the PRI had was a system where they created these trade unions and peasant organizations to look like they were getting democratic input when really they were run by party activists who were basically doing the party and the president's bidding. The PRI also co-opted the opposition, which included the press as well as weak political parties, because really the idea was that if you play with the PRI, you might get to sit at the table where decisions are made. If you oppose the PRI, if you actually try to challenge them openly for party, you're not even going to get into the room. Okay? This led to lots of issues of corruption because there wasn't, for example, anyone sort of holding the PRI accountable for whether or not they're actually using the taxpayer dollars correctly ethically, etc. But the idea is that the PRI stayed in power and provided this political stability. But in order to do that, they didn't have a lot of power for anyone other than the president. The party itself did not share power with anyone else. And the party used its power to sort of keep the opposition at bay. And frequently that meant like they gave out government contracts and things like that in a way that would sort of get people to be their friends. We're going to talk about this as this corporatist system. This corporatist system is a really unique feature to the Mexican model up until the 1990s. And this corporatist system kept Mexico with the PRI in power, with one-party dominance, and kept this political stability. When the PRI starts to fall apart, their corporatist system falls apart, which is what we're going to talk about. So the political party power by the PRI starts to erode in the 1980s. In part, that has to do with the fact there was an economic crisis. So everyone's happy with the PRI when they can get money from the government, and the government can be like, here, we'll give you a government contract. Here, we'll give you a government contract. And a lot of that money came from oil money in Mexico. But really, their economy starts to fall apart in the 1980s, which means that the government has to make budget cuts, which makes it harder to keep people in your pockets because you'd have less money to basically bribe them. The PRI started to have to use more and more blatant electoral fraud in order to stay in political power. And that made people angry because it was becoming more and more apparent that actually the PRI didn't deserve to win, that people were interested in voting for other parties. In 1998, President Salinas de Gortari actually wins, and his election leads to massive protest because it's so obvious that he committed fraud. And so, through the people's demands, they set up the Federal Electoral Institute, or the IFE. And it's established to actually, separate from the PRI, separate from the government, actually monitor these elections. And then what you see after that is, the PRI stops winning all the time. And that's because there's actually an independent process happening to decide whether or not they actually won. And so in 1997, a coalition is elected to the Chamber of Deputies. So all of a sudden, right then, you don't have the PRI having all of the controlling votes in Congress. And the PRD, which is a different political party, a leftist political party, they win the mayorship of DF, of the Distrito Federal, the federal district, which is Mexico City. So that's the largest city of Mexico, one of the largest cities in the world, and it's controlled by a different political party, not by the PRI. In 1993, NAFTA is passed, and so the PRI is looking for using free trade and setting this free trade agreement with the United States, hoping that this will help them with some of their economic problems. But what ends up happening is that even sparks even more revolt. And on January 1st of 1994, the EZLN, which is the National Army of Liberation named after Zapata, that's what the Z stands for. Again, Zapata, if you recall, is from the Mexican Revolution. They begin an uprising in Chiapas, in the very southern part of Mexico that's near Guatemala. And they start actually having an armed rebellion against the Mexican government, when clearly the PRI is no longer providing stability at that point, if you have like actual armed uprising happening. And then in 2000, the PAN, which is a conservative political party, right of the PRI, they actually win the presidency for the first time. So this class is not a history class, but it's important to understand that from 1929 to 2000, the PRI is in power. But it's important to understand that 2000, things change. Okay? So if you look at this, you've got PRI, PAN, PRI, and now our current president in Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is called AMLO as his nickname. He was formerly the PRD mayor of Mexico City, and then he formally ran for presidency under the PRD, but then he founded this coalition Morena, and he was elected in 2018. So if you look at it, between 2000 and 2018, we have 3 different parties that have been in charge in Mexico. Boom, right there. They went from having a one-party system to now having a multi-party system in Mexico. They had one-party control. Now they have 3 political parties that are all like, national parties that get seats in Congress and can actually run for and win the presidency. So if you think about it, before 2000, Mexico had what's called a one-party system or one-party dominance. The president would pick their successor because they had a 6-year term or a sexennial. The president would pick the governor and congressional candidates who then won because there wasn't actual opposition to them. The president had the informal power to remove governors, so there wasn't really anyone at the state level who would challenge the president's authority. And the judicial branch was subordinate to the president. So again, on paper, it looked like there were 3 branches, but it was a very president-dominant system, and that presidency was controlled by one political party. After 2000, we end up having a multi-party system in Mexico. And you can make the argument that even before 2000, Mexico had a multi-party system. But it's really official after 2000 because at that point, that's the first time the PAN wins the presidency. So the PRI now has an open primary to determine who their presidential candidate will be. They no longer have the president pick the successor. Governors and therefore states have the authority separate from the president because there are actual real elections. It's not predetermined who's going to win. The government has decentralized power to the states. Mexico is now functioning much more like a true federal system, whereas before it was more of a federal system in name only. The PRI does not have a supermajority in Congress, so now there's a coalition and an actual check on the president. The Congress and the president can actually have debate, actually disagree with each other, and the Congress can actually pass bills that the president might not like, okay? And now the judicial branch has been given more independence. So if you think about it, these governments are sort of on a spectrum. You have substantive democracy on one hand, authoritarian dictatorship to the other. Up until 2000, most political scientists would characterize Mexico as being some form of a procedural democracy. They had elections, they had rights, but they didn't have real elections, they didn't have real debate, there wasn't real space for opposition, etc. Now in Mexico, there are real elections. Who's going to win is not predetermined. The government doesn't use the corporate system anymore. But what you're going to see when we talk about current events in Mexico is that it's not totally a safe place to protest. There isn't safe space for criticisms of the government yet. And they don't have a functioning judicial system, they don't have functioning civil rights or civil liberties, and a lot of that has to do with the gang violence and the drug war that's going on in Mexico. So again, I wouldn't say that Mexico has reached substantive democracy, but wow, has there been a lot of change that's actually happened in 20 years in Mexico.